But first, I would like to acknowledge and pay respects to the Yagara people, the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on today. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak. I'm speaking on behalf of myself and Joanna Richardson and Kennan. The three of us together are working on this project, and I'm going to talk today about the work we've been doing over the past few months and what we're hoping to do in the next couple of months on this particular issue. So we thought we'd start with why we're sort of looking into this question about professional development and education of people working in scholarly communication. One of the reasons is this is an area of work that is increasing within academic libraries, and so there is a growing need both in Australia and around the world for people who have these sorts of skills. The issue is that's been identified anecdotally and demonstrated as well in the US and the UK is that there's a distinct lack of formal education and training opportunities in this area. And there was a recent US study last year on imposter phenomenon in scholarly communication practitioners. And when I posted that on one of our discussion sites, it elicited some interesting discussions offline, which sort of triggered this project. So we made the decision to investigate the current context in Australasia. So scholarly communication tends to be looked after by people working in the library. These are some examples of scholarly communication officers. They include ones in the UK, in the US, and here in Australia. So let's consider, what do people in scholarly communication ought to know? The photographs in this presentation are all mine. This is taken from the stacks at Cambridge University Library, where the books come in, and they used to come in and just be put in numerical order. And this wonderful series was one that caught my eye when I was up there one day. So in 2017, there was a US study that was done that identified a problem with the education with LIS graduates, and they were saying that they don't enter the field with any significant education around scholarly communication. A study in 2020 that was also in the US noted there was a lack of formal training in scholarly communication. So we're making a distinction here between education, training, and professional development. And that the problem with this is many early career practitioners are underprepared for the work. A Finland study that was done in 2020 identified that the new services being offered by libraries in this sort of area meant that there were new roles and new skills that were required. And the comment they made that the development of these new open science and research support services, infrastructures and tools would also require qualifications beyond those of traditional library skills. So one of the things that I've noticed over the years is that we've got a distinct difference in academic librarianship, and to some extent health librarianship, that is different to other types of librarianship, because we're involved in an environment where the information is being produced where we are, and we're not just consuming it. So it's different to let's say, a public library. So then we start looking at what are the kind of skills? What are the skill sets that are required of people who work in this area? And there has been some work done on that. NACIG, which is a Canadian group, came up with their core competencies for scholarly communication librarians. And in a very similar year, they were both in about 2016, the Adjunct group came up with the librarians competencies profile for scholarly communication and open access. There's a lot of overlap between these two, but they're not exactly the same. There are some distinctive differences, so it's worth considering both, not just one. But then when you look at the local context in Australia, the skill set, which is what the basis is for our current library degrees, comes from ALIA, the Foundation Knowledge, Skills and Attribution for Information Professionals. And they do not in any way map against the scholarly communication competencies. Now, I'm under the understanding that that foundation skills are being reviewed at the moment, and I suspect that the new version will be more contemporary and probably will encompass some of these skills, but currently that's our circumstance. But there is also a discussion that's going on within ALIA about who should have sort of ownership of the education of our library community. So it's a bit of a hot topic in Australia at the moment. So this is the study I referred to before about the imposter phenomenon. And the author made the conclusion that scholarly communications librarians experience imposter phenomenon more frequently and intensely than academic librarians more broadly. So that's a problem. And we use this study as one of the sections of our study. We have permission, we're in correspondence with Erin about that. There was a study that I did with my colleague Claire Sewell in 2016 in Cambridge, where we looked at the educational background of people working in scholarly communication. That was a fairly open survey, and we had over 400 responses, or 500, I'm sorry, responses from around the world. We were a bit surprised. It was not much bigger than we thought it was going to be. This educational section, the educational section of our study is partly based on this study as well. So we're hoping to have some comparators with what we find against what has been done prior. So in that study, the Cambridge study, what we discovered was that there was a strong tendency towards on-the-job and self-directed learning. So in these two graphs, we've got the green, which is a formal training options, the blue, which is on-the-job training, and the yellow, which is self-directed learning. And the first one, this here is talking about future needs, and the one to the right is talking about current needs. Now, what that indicates is that people working in scholarly communication are pretty tenacious and have to just get on with it and work it out for themselves. And it does mean that they may or may not be given time within their own workloads to manage this extra requirement to stay on top of what's happening. So we do need to be conscious of this as being quite a big issue. So we come to our study, which is was hoping to just be 2020, but is 2020 to 2021. And what we're looking at is scholarly communication knowledge and skills in Australasian research institutions, so Australia and New Zealand. We've got a web page, which is the URL is there, and we also have on that web page the question list that is the survey instrument, so that can be viewed by anybody who's interested. So we're building on previous studies. So we broke the study into three parts. The first one was about your job. The second one is the confidence in competencies. So this section is modified from Erin's work on the imposter phenomenon study. And we made that decision to not work on the imposter phenomenon aspect of the study because for two reasons. One was there were some limitations about how much we were able to share of our findings from the imposter phenomenon survey instrument because of the copyright owner, which didn't gel with our feelings towards FAIR. And the other reason is because we don't feel that we're qualified to make implications or understand what that means if somebody were to indicate a high level of imposter phenomenon, how that would really map in any sort of psychological sense against confidence. So we decided not to go with that, but we've maintained the confidence in competencies section with some additions. And then about your qualifications and training, as I mentioned, the section's modified from the UK study. One of the things we need to think about is what do we talk about when we're talking about scholarly communication? So we've indicated these tasks: institutional repository management, publishing services, research practice, copyright services, OA policies, and the scholarly communication landscape, which is a section we added in, data management services, and assessment and impact. In each of those, we've got a section in the survey and people had the option of saying that this was part of their job or not part of their job, and they only needed to answer if it were part of their job. So our preliminary findings. We had a total of 161 responses, but one of them, as you will see, is somebody who didn't work in Australia or New Zealand, so they were eliminated. So we have 160 full responses. But I had such a high number of the incomplete responses, we had a look. It seemed clear that 31 were not genuine attempts because they didn't get past the second question. 8 were clearly genuine attempts where they had completed not only many questions but added comments, but they hadn't gone all the way through the survey to the final submit point. So that's a shame. The 28 remaining, it's unclear if they're genuine or not. My sense is they were, but I can't say definitively. So our demographic breakdown, we see that little mark down the bottom there. That's the one person that was not in an Australian or a New Zealand library or research institution. So predominantly Australia, but we've got a good representation from New Zealand. If we look at the Australian responses, what we've done is map them in terms of just the universities, and we did have other institutions that were not universities who responded, but mapping them against the universities, we can see that there's a clear higher response from Queensland, Victoria and New South Wales, even though those states have more research institutions and universities. Nonetheless, it's a proportionally higher response from those 3 states. In New Zealand, we had all but 1 institution represented, and 2 of the incomplete genuine attempts were also from New Zealand. Now, here's some of the sort of background of the people. We've got experienced libraries in this group. The percentage of people in the library for more than 10 years is 62%, but the percentage of scholarly communication roles that are less than 10 years is 79%. So we've got experienced people, but the roles are quite new. And one of the things we noticed that was quite striking was that a large proportion are juggling scholarly communication with other tasks. And that's itself quite a challenge for those people, I would imagine, because it is such a complex area. So to be managing it on top of other work as well would be pretty challenging. So we've just started our analysis. What we're looking at and the sort of research questions we're exploring, we're using quantitative and qualitative analysis, and NVivo is helping us with the qualitative analysis of the comments. We want to analyse the level of confidence in the different scholarly communication competencies and cross-reference these levels against their educational background. We want to explore and describe the implications of these findings in relation to future educational and training support in this area, because I think this does need to be addressed collectively. We're hoping to publish in 2021. Very much so, seeing as it's very early 2021. And so watch this space. So I hope I'll just give you one indication of how broad the kind of responses can be. So one of the questions we asked was, to what extent do you feel supported in your role by the wider institution? So this is not the library itself, but the institution in which the library sits, if you were working in a library. The responses on the right-hand side are people who are saying effectively they don't feel supported. And the people on the right-hand side, the green, are the people who feel that they are supported, and the people on the left-hand side in the orange are the ones who feel they are not supported. And you can start to see when you look at these responses, the nuance in some of the responses that are coming through from people. It's quite interesting. The comments in some ways are the most interesting part. So that's the bit that's going to take us more time to analyse. But I hope that's given you some indication about why we're doing this project and what we're hoping to find. We did also make the point that when in our call to participate, that we would make a donation for each survey that is completed, and we have done that. So we've made a $500 donation to the Canberra Indigenous Scholarships Foundation at Australian National University to support Indigenous students. So I'm happy to chat in the minutes we have left and answer any questions.
I've got a whole stream here, so I'm going to start the one that says here, how are we defining scholarly communications librarians?
So that was the list that I put up, which was saying what the tasks were. So we're not. This is not a survey of scholarly communications librarians, although a large proportion of the respondents will be scholarly communication librarians. We're saying if you are doing work in these areas, we'd like to hear from you. And so that was the list of institutional repository management, research data management, copyright services, and so on. So it is defined.
Thank you. We do have a few questions about imposter phenomenon, and I know you weren't addressing that in your paper, but along the lines of, do you have any advice on how those in the field can overcome the imposter syndrome, just based on your reading and research?
I'm going to go back in time to when CARES first started, and when we were talking about getting rid of the originals thesis sharing program and moving everything into Trove. And I was working at Australian National University at the time, and I said, can we please just hold off because we're really slow and we haven't got our theses across. We're having major problems. And what happened then, everyone just went, oh, because they thought Australian National University would be way ahead and everything was great. And so simply by saying, we're having trouble, it opened up a whole lot of conversations. And that was when I realized that we really need to share with one another our experiences in this area, so that we can all understand that we all feel the same way, that nobody's on top of all of this, that it is hard and it's changing all the time. So community of practice, I think, is really, really important. So it's not going to solve the imposter phenomenon issue, but it will at least make you realize you're not alone, because you're not.
That's great. That's a lovely answer too. And another question on imposter syndrome is, what do you think the rate of imposter syndrome is in scholarly communications or research support librarians compared to other library roles?
Well, I think that's actually what Erin's study did identify. So I'd read her paper. It's quite interesting, actually. So I will tweet out. I've tweeted out a link to our the slides, but I will tweet out a link to each of the studies after this talk, so that way they're in the RSCD Day Twitter feed, and you can open them up.
Okay. Now, I've got another question that I have here on the screen, and that's subject librarians or functional roles. And some academic libraries are organising interdiscipline-based teams, whereas others are organised into functional teams. Can you elaborate on the different challenges faced by each?
Yes, and this is where the probably the large proportion of the people who say they're juggling scholarly communication with other tasks is probably sitting. The types of people who are subject or liaison librarians who are having to do a multitude of tasks. The tricky thing here is that we really need to have some people who have some expertise in this area, and that can't be everybody. So I think if we are in a circumstance where we have arrangements where we've got subject-based sort of framing of our staff, then we do need to actually supplement that with some expertise that is held in individuals, so that we've got somebody who, even if it's a small library and you don't have the luxury of having somebody dedicated to research data management, that you might have that person is the one who concentrates on being as up to date as they can be on research data management, and somebody else can concentrate on being as much as they can on something else. Because I think otherwise, really, you're just going to go insane and be completely overworked. So I think there's no perfect solution, because really we know we're all severely understaffed, and it's worse after what's been going on in the last sort of few months. And so I think understanding that, and hopefully some of the messages that will come out of this study, is that this is an area of expertise, and it does need to be supported both in terms of appreciating the value of the staff who work in this area, but also allowing time for those people to do the self-development and professional development that they need. And that also then means allowing space for people to get that expertise.
And not a question here, but just one from me, is that, are you seeing a trend towards more teams based on function, or a combination within an institution?
I'd not heard of functional librarians before going overseas. It was a conference I was at, and I thought it was a strange word, because does it mean that everybody else is dysfunctional librarian? I mean, it's a very weird word. But yeah, the fact that that's even sort of being talked about, and it's terminology we really weren't using very much 5 years ago, would indicate that it does seem to be somewhere we're moving towards. And I think it probably reflects the fact that we can't all be generalists, because it's getting more and more complicated, all this stuff, particularly when it comes to research support, because you start looking at impact, and not just bibliometrics, but research impact to societal impact and so on. It gets very complex, and so we can't expect some subject librarian who's got expertise in, let's say, medical librarianship, to also have expertise in all these other areas. It's just unrealistic.
We just had a message in the chat from Graham to say, hands up all the dysfunctional librarians out there. I know that, yeah, my hand would go up. Okay, we've got, I think, 1 minute left. I've got 2 questions remaining. One is about tenacity. At the beginning of your presentation, you I would say admirably noted that librarians who work in this field are very tenacious. How do we bring that in? How do we attract people with tenacity?
I think that's really interesting. And it's interesting when you look at the NACIG core competencies, they actually have a section. They've got things like institutional repositories and copyright services, etc. And one whole section is on personal strengths. And that is talking to the tenacity question, because there's a lot of advocacy. There's a lot of talking to people about things they don't want to hear. There's a lot of, well, what would you know? And you've got to kind of just swallow that and go, well, quite a lot. So you do have to be tenacious working in this area. And so I think we do need to think about how we recruit generally. We tend to recruit everybody the same way. And this discussion came up in the UK about somebody's son who did some recruitment into Tesco's, which is a supermarket there, to be a checkout person. And it was a whole day. And they did all sorts of like exercises and stuff to do with sort of teamwork and all sorts of things. And yet we will interview somebody for a role that's quite a high role that requires all sorts of skills, and we'll give them a 45-minute interview and ask them 5 questions, including something like talk about a time you showed some innovation or something like that. Perhaps we need to change the way we recruit people.
Yes, totally agree with that. Okay, now my last question, and I think everyone will be asking this, how did you make that captioning happen on your PowerPoint? I
had to, I can't tell you the exact thing because I had to do it for something else when I was recording, and it was extremely complicated, but once I worked it out, I'll tell you what, I'll work it back out and I'll tweet it out.
Oh yeah, tweet it to all of us, please.